The light from Matthias Reichert's cabin glowed golden against the whiteout, a beacon impossible to miss, even through snow falling so thick you could barely see your own hands. 3 families would stumble toward that light through 40 degrees below zero temperatures over the next 2 days, and every single one of them would survive in a shelter the entire community had mocked him for building just months earlier. Before we begin, let us know where you're watching from, and if stories like this move you, hit that subscribe button, because tomorrow's episode is even more unbelievable than this one. The blizzard had been raging for 16 hours when Matthias first saw movement through the wall of white. He stood just inside his doorway, the heavy log door propped open despite the storm, watching the darkness beyond his lamplight. The temperature outside had dropped to 45 degrees below zero, according to the thermometer mounted beside his doorframe. Wind screamed through the pines with a sound like tearing canvas. Snow fell so heavily that it didn't drift so much as accumulate in solid sheets wherever the wind pressed it. This was the storm old-timers had warned about, the kind that came once in a generation and killed anyone unprepared. Behind him, the cave stretched back 30 feet into solid rock, warm and dry. A single fire burned in his stone fireplace, flames reflecting off the smooth limestone walls. The interior temperature held steady at 48 degrees, comfortable enough that he wore only a wool shirt despite the hell unleashing itself outside. His dog, a gray and white husky named Casper, lay near the fire, unconcerned. The cave cabin had required no additional fuel for the past 4 hours. The rock itself, heated through the day, continued radiating warmth even as the storm tried to freeze the world solid. Movement again. Matthias raised his lantern higher, stepping into the protected space beneath the cave's overhang. The rock extended, 12 feet beyond his cabin's front wall, creating a natural porch that kept the worst of the snow away from his entrance. Out in the storm, shapes materialized. 3 figures, hunched against the wind, staggering. He could hear shouting now, barely audible over the storm's roar. Thomas Kerr emerged from the whiteout first, carrying a child bundled in blankets. His wife Margaret came behind him, clutching their second child, a girl perhaps 8 years old who could barely walk against the wind. Ice caked Thomas's beard. His eyes were wild with cold and desperation. He saw Matthias and the open door behind him, saw the golden light spilling from the impossible warmth within, and his face crumpled with relief so profound it looked like pain. Matthias stepped forward, taking the smaller child from Thomas's arms. The boy was unconscious, his lips blue. Margaret was weeping, her tears freezing on her cheeks. Matthias guided them through his door into the warmth. Thomas Kerr, who months earlier had been one of the loudest voices mocking Matthias for building into a cave like a savage, who had questioned his manhood and his sanity in front of half the settlement, collapsed to his knees just inside the threshold. His hands shook as he held them toward the fire. The little girl Margaret carried began crying, a good sign that meant she still had strength. Matthias closed the door against the storm. The wind's scream became muffled, distant. The cave's thermal mass had already absorbed the brief intrusion of cold air. Within minutes, the temperature would stabilize again. He looked at the Kerr family, at their frost-bitten faces and their desperate gratitude, and felt no satisfaction. Only the grim certainty that before this storm ended, more would come seeking the shelter they had ridiculed him for creating. The cabin Matthias and Elise had built in the autumn of 1869 was typical of frontier construction. They had selected a site near a creek, felled 47 logs, and notched them at the corners using the saddle joint method every settler knew. The work took them 9 days. They chinked the gaps with moss and clay, hung a plank door on leather hinges, covered one window opening with oiled paper, and built a simple mud fireplace in the corner. It looked like every other cabin scattered across the Montana Territory. It functioned like every other cabin too, which meant it barely functioned at all when winter came in earnest. December brought the first serious cold. Temperatures dropped to 20 degrees below zero, and Matthias began to understand the cabin's limitations. The fire had to burn continuously. Even then, frost formed on the interior walls by morning. The oiled paper window covering did almost nothing to prevent heat loss. Cold air poured through gaps in the chinking that had seemed adequate during construction. The leather door hinges stiffened and cracked. Every surface not within 3 feet of the fire remained, bitterly cold. Elise developed a cough in early January. Nothing serious at first, just the dry hack that came from breathing cold air and wood smoke in equal measure. She wrapped herself in blankets and stayed close to the fire. Matthias kept the flames going day and night, burning through their wood supply at an alarming rate. He spent half of each day cutting and hauling more fuel, working in cold that made his lungs ache and his fingers go numb inside heavy mittens. By late January, the cough had worsened. Elise's face looked drawn and pale. She rarely left the area immediately around the fireplace. Matthias hung blankets to create a smaller space, trying to concentrate what heat they had. It helped marginally. The cabin's fundamental problem remained unsolvable through simple measures. Heat poured out through 4 walls, through the roof, through every gap and crack in the construction. The fire could only produce so much warmth. The structure could not retain enough of it to maintain life-sustaining temperatures during the coldest nights. February brought temperatures that dropped to 40 degrees below zero for 3 consecutive nights. Matthias burned furniture to keep the fire going. He burned half their winter supplies of wooden boxes and crates. Nothing was sufficient. The interior temperature, even directly beside the roaring fire, barely reached 40 degrees. Further from the flames, frost formed on every surface. Elise could not get warm no matter how many blankets covered her. She died on February 19, 1870. The doctor from the settlement, who arrived 2 days later when the cold finally broke, said it was pneumonia. Matthias knew better. The disease had killed her, but the cabin had made it possible. A shelter that could not maintain adequate warmth had sentenced his wife to death as surely as a failed roof would have crushed her beneath collapsed logs. He buried Elise on a hillside overlooking the creek where they had drawn water throughout their single winter together. Spring came eventually, indifferent to grief. Snow melted, revealing the winter-killed grass and the gaps in cabin construction that became so obvious in daylight. Matthias walked through the structure he and Elise had built, seeing it differently now. Every notched corner was a thermal bridge conducting heat outward. Every gap in the chinking was a pathway for warmth to escape and cold to enter. The 4 walls, the roof, the floor, all were surfaces that radiated precious heat into the frozen air outside. The design was fundamentally flawed, yet it was the same design every settler used. He began asking questions. When trappers and hunters passed through on their way to the trading post, he asked about their cabins. How cold did the interiors get during the worst weather? How much wood did they burn each day? Had anyone found ways to improve heat retention? The answers were consistently discouraging. Everyone struggled with the same problems. Cabins were cold, fires consumed enormous amounts of fuel, people died in harsh winters when fuel ran out or when illness combined with inadequate warmth. Most men accepted this as the cost of frontier living. Matthias could not. He understood now that Elise's death had been preventable, not through better medicine or different timing, but through better shelter. If the cabin had maintained 50 degrees instead of dropping to 30, if the walls had held heat instead of bleeding it away, if the structure had required half as much fuel, she might have survived. That knowledge was unbearable and transformative. He spent April and May studying heat. He had no formal education, no training in physics or engineering, but he had practical intelligence and obsessive focus. He burned different types of wood and measured how long each maintained flames. He built small test structures using various chinking materials and measured interior temperatures. He discovered that clay mixed with animal hair created stronger, more flexible chinking than moss alone. He learned that pine resin, when boiled down and mixed with clay, produced a waterproof seal. He experimented with different door designs, testing how various methods of hanging and sealing affected heat loss. The settlers who saw his experiments thought grief had unhinged him. A man measuring temperatures inside miniature log structures, mixing batches of clay and hair, burning endless test fires. It looked like madness. But Matthias was learning principles that would save lives. Heat moved from warm areas to cool areas. This movement could be slowed, but never stopped. The key was reducing the surface area through which heat could escape and increasing the mass of material that could absorb and retain warmth. Wood had low thermal mass. It heated quickly and cooled quickly. Stone had high thermal mass. It heated slowly but retained warmth for hours after the heat source was removed. By June, Matthias understood what he needed: a structure with minimal surface area exposed to outside cold, walls made of or backed by material with high thermal mass, superior sealing against air infiltration. These requirements pointed toward a solution that seemed impossible, yet he could not ignore the logic. Summer hunting took Matthias into the hills west of his cabin site. He was tracking elk through pine forest when he noticed the cliff face. Limestone, weathered gray and tan, rising perhaps 80 feet above the slope. The formation ran for a quarter-mile along the hillside, and near the center there was an opening. He approached cautiously, rifle ready. Caves meant bears, mountain lions, or other animals that might object to intrusion. The entrance was massive, 20 feet wide at the base, 30 feet high, opening into darkness. Matthias lit a torch from materials he carried and stepped inside. The temperature change was immediate. Outside, the July afternoon was warm, perhaps 75 degrees. Inside the cave, the air felt cool and stable, probably 55 degrees. He moved deeper, examining the space. The ceiling height remained consistent, the floor relatively level. Small animal droppings near the entrance, but nothing recent. No bear sign, no indication of current occupation by anything dangerous. 30 feet in, the cave narrowed, but continued deeper. Matthias stayed in the main chamber studying the rock walls. The limestone was solid, ancient, stable. Water had carved this space over thousands of years, but the carving was long finished. The rock was dry, the structure sound. He stood there for several minutes, thinking. The temperature remained constant, no drafts, no variation despite the summer heat outside. The rock itself was massive beyond calculation. Millions of pounds of stone that maintained its temperature regardless of conditions outside. He returned the next day with a thermometer and lantern. The interior measured 54 degrees in the morning, 55 degrees in the afternoon. He returned at night. 54 degrees. The cave's temperature was essentially constant, buffered by the enormous thermal mass of the surrounding rock. In winter, he reasoned, the temperature would drop, but slowly. If he could heat the interior, the rock would absorb that heat and radiate it back for hours. The cave faced south, meaning the entrance received maximum sun exposure during winter months. The opening was protected from north winds by the cliff itself. Matthias spent a week visiting the cave at different times, in different weather conditions, taking measurements. The temperature never varied more than 3 degrees from its average. When he built a small fire near the back wall and let it burn for an hour, the rock absorbed the heat. 6 hours after the fire died, the wall remained noticeably warm to the touch. He began to understand what this meant. This cave could be transformed into a shelter that would solve every problem that had killed Elise. The rock would provide 3 walls and a ceiling with massive thermal capacity. He would only need to build 1 wall to seal the entrance. Heat loss would be reduced to a fraction of a traditional cabin. The structure could never collapse under snow. Matthias returned to the settlement in late July to purchase supplies. He needed tools, hardware, and materials that could only be obtained at the trading post Benjamin Wade operated from a large log building near the confluence of 2 creeks. The settlement consisted of perhaps 20 families scattered within a 10-mile radius, plus the trading post, a small church, and a dozen transient trappers and hunters who passed through regularly. Word spread quickly in such communities. When Matthias mentioned his plan to build into the cave, the reaction was immediate and harsh. Cyrus Dalton, a trapper who had worked the territory for 15 years, laughed openly. He told everyone within earshot that Matthias Reichert had bazad, lost his mind to grief, and was planning to live like a savage in a hole in the ground. Owen Blackwood, who had helped Matthias build his original cabin, said it was an insult to civilized men everywhere. Living in caves was what animals did, what Indians did before they learned better. A white man built a proper cabin with 4 walls and a roof. Thomas Kerr, a Scottish settler with a wife and 2 children, was particularly vocal. He questioned whether a man who would retreat into a cave could be trusted around decent people. He suggested that Matthias was abandoning the principles of civilization that separated Christians from heathens. Others joined in. The mockery spread through the settlement like fire through dry grass. Within 2 days, everyone knew that Matthias Reichert was building a cave dwelling, and everyone had an opinion about what that meant. Benjamin Wade made jokes about it at the trading post. He asked Matthias if he planned to hibernate through winter like a bear. He wondered aloud whether Matthias would be growing fur next. Other customers laughed. The jokes were mean-spirited, but delivered with smiles, the kind of social cruelty that frontier communities excelled at. Matthias purchased his supplies without responding. He bought square-cut nails, iron brackets, heavy hinges, canvas, and specialized tools. The unusual order prompted more questions and more mockery. Reverend Peter Ashford, who traveled a circuit between several small settlements, heard about Matthias's plan and made a point of visiting him. The Reverend was not unkind, but he was concerned. He suggested that retreating into a cave represented a spiritual regression, a turning away from the light of civilization into literal darkness. He offered to pray with Matthias, to help him overcome the grief that was clearly driving him toward poor decisions. Matthias thanked him politely and declined. Henrik Larsen, a Norwegian settler who lived 8 miles west, visited Matthias at the old cabin site. Henrik was different from the others. He listened when Matthias explained the thermal mass principle, the heat retention advantages, the structural benefits. Henrik understood the logic but shook his head anyway. He said it made sense on paper, but people would never accept it. Living in a cave carried too much social stigma. Even if it worked perfectly, Matthias would be marked as an outsider, possibly shunned. Was survival worth that price? Matthias said it was. Matthias spent August studying the cave with systematic precision. He measured the entrance dimensions carefully, finding it 22 feet wide at the base and tapering to 18 feet at a height of 12 feet. The opening extended upward another 18 feet beyond that, creating a natural overhang that would protect any structure built at the base. The main chamber was 33 feet deep, 20 feet wide on average, and maintained a ceiling height of 14 feet throughout. The floor was nearly level, sloping slightly toward the entrance for natural drainage. He examined the rock composition. Limestone, dense and hard, with minimal cracks or fissures, the formation had existed for thousands of years based on the weathering patterns. It would exist for thousands more. He tested the walls by striking them with a hammer, listening for hollow sounds that might indicate instability. Everything was solid. He looked for signs of water infiltration. The rock was dry except near the very back of the main chamber, where slight moisture indicated a deeper water source far below. That moisture would provide humidity in winter, preventing the air from becoming too dry. The thermal properties fascinated him most. He conducted experiments building fires at different locations within the cave and measuring how the heat dispersed. When he built a fire near the back wall, the heat rose and spread across the ceiling, warming the entire rock mass gradually. The stone absorbed thermal energy, slowly but retained it for remarkable periods. A fire burned for 2 hours could keep the rock noticeably warm for 8 to 10 hours afterward. During that time, the rock radiated heat back into the space, maintaining temperature without additional fuel. He calculated the approximate mass of rock that would surround his living space. The back wall, side ceiling, represented roughly 4,000 cubic feet of limestone. At approximately 150 pounds per cubic foot, that meant 600,000 pounds of stone forming his shelter. That mass, once heated, would act as an enormous battery, storing thermal energy and releasing it gradually. No wooden cabin could match that thermal capacity. Wood heated quickly and cooled quickly. Stone was patient. The entrance orientation was critical. Facing south meant maximum sun exposure during winter months when the sun tracked low across the southern sky. The overhang would provide shade in summer when the sun was high, keeping the interior cool. In winter, the low angle would allow sunlight to penetrate deep into the cave, providing passive heating. The cliff behind and above the entrance blocked northern winds completely. This natural protection meant the entrance would never face the worst weather directly. Matthias sketched plans for the front wall he would build. It needed to seal the entrance completely, while providing a door, windows, and ventilation. The wall would be the only surface through which heat could escape, which meant it had to be constructed with exceptional care. Every gap, every crack, every poorly fitted joint would waste the thermal advantage the cave provided. He planned to use logs fitted so precisely that chinking would be minimal, almost decorative, rather than functional. Construction began in early September when temperatures were still comfortable for outdoor work. Matthias started by clearing the cave entrance area of debris and loose rock. He created a level foundation, using flat stones fitted together, extending the natural floor outward to create a stable base for his wall. This foundation work took 3 days. Most builders would have skipped it, but Matthias understood that everything built on top would only be as stable as the base beneath. Log selection consumed 2 weeks. He walked through the surrounding forest, examining hundreds of trees before choosing the ones he would cut. He wanted pine logs approximately 14 inches in diameter with minimal taper and straight grain. Most settlers grabbed whatever trees were convenient. Matthias selected each log individually, rejecting any with significant defects. He needed logs that would fit together with minimal gaps. Irregular logs with knots, curves, or taper would create spaces that would leak heat. He cut each tree carefully, trimmed it to precise length, and hauled it to the cave using a simple sled arrangement pulled by a mule he had purchased specifically for construction work. Each log was stripped completely of bark using his draw knife. The process was exhausting. A single log required 3 to 4 hours of steady work to strip clean. But bark created irregular surfaces and gaps. Stripped logs with consistent diameter could be fitted together much more tightly. The actual wall construction began in late September. Matthias had designed a system that would integrate the log wall directly into the cave's rock surfaces. He cut notches into the limestone at the sides of the entrance using hammer and chisel, creating recesses where the log ends would fit. This was slow work. Stone was harder than wood and less forgiving of mistakes. Each recess had to be precise, angled slightly to shed water, deep enough to hold the log end securely. The first log went into place on September 28th. Matthias lifted it using a lever system, positioned it into the rock notches he had cut, and secured it with wooden wedges. The log spanned the entrance width, resting on the stone foundation he had prepared and locked into the rock walls on either side. It was absolutely level. He verified this with a water level he had constructed from a length of hollow reed and a wooden frame. Level was critical. Every log above would rest on this first one. The second log went up the following day. Matthias shaped the contact surface where it would rest on the first log, using his draw knife to create a slight concave curve that would match the convex surface below. When the 2 logs came together, the gap between them was less than a 1/4 inch. He packed his clay horsehair resin mixture into that gap while it was still warm and pliable. The mixture filled the space completely, creating a seal that would be both flexible and waterproof once cured. By mid-October, The wall had risen to 6 feet, halfway to the height Matthias needed. Each log was fitted with the same obsessive care. He would test-fit a log, find where it touched unevenly, remove it, shape the contact surfaces, test-fit again, and repeat until satisfied. Some logs required 6 or 7 fitting attempts before achieving the precision he demanded. Other builders would have called this wasteful perfectionism. Matthias knew it was the difference between a wall that leaked heat and one that did not. The chimney integration was the most complex element. He could not simply build a fireplace inside and hope for adequate draft. The cave's depth and the entrance configuration would affect how smoke moved. He designed a stone chimney that would be built into the log wall itself, with the firebox positioned to radiate heat both into the living space and against the cave's back wall. The placement was calculated. Heat from the firebox would warm the immediate area. That warmth would rise, spreading across the cave ceiling. The heated ceiling would radiate downward. The back wall, warmed by reflected heat, would radiate forward. The entire cave would become a heat distribution system. He gathered flat stones for the chimney from a creek bed 2 miles away. Each stone was selected for shape and size, carried back individually. He needed stones that would fit together with minimal mortar, creating a structure that would last decades. The chimney rose inside the cabin, integrated into the wall structure, and extended upward past the log wall height. Where the logs ended at 12 feet, the chimney continued upward another 6 feet, reaching above the cave's overhang to ensure proper draft. The firebox design incorporated principles he had observed in well-built fireplaces in Missouri. He created a smoke shelf halfway up the chimney, a horizontal ledge that would prevent downdrafts and reflect heat back into the room. The firebox opening was sized to create efficient combustion, large enough to accept substantial logs, but small enough to concentrate heat. The back wall of the firebox was angled forward slightly, creating a surface that would radiate heat into the room, rather than straight up the chimney. Door construction began in early November. Matthias had purchased thick planks from the sawmill near the trading post, selecting pieces of dense pine with straight grain. He shaped each plank using his draw knife, creating a tongue on one edge and a groove on the other. When assembled, the planks interlocked, forming a door that was effectively a single solid piece 3 inches thick. He reinforced the interior face with iron brackets arranged in an X pattern, through-bolted with the square-cut nails. The hinges were massive, each weighing 15 pounds, mortised into both the door and the adjacent log, so they became part of the structure rather than attachments that could be torn free. The door was hung in mid-November, the last major construction element. Matthias tested the swing, adjusted the fit, and installed his locking mechanism, a heavy beam that slid horizontally through iron brackets and into a mortise cut into the rock wall itself. The Boza wall reached its full height of 12 feet in late November. Matthias stepped back to examine what he had created. The log structure sealed the cave entrance completely, transforming the natural chamber into an enclosed space. The precision fitting he had obsessed over was evident. Gaps between logs were minimal, rarely exceeding a 1/4 inch, and every space was filled with his clay horsehair resin mixture. The wall appeared almost seamless, each log flowing into the next with barely visible joints. Henrik Larsson visited during the final week of construction. He walked around the structure, examining the integration of logs into rock, the chimney rising through the center, the massive door hanging perfectly plumb. Henrik was a skilled carpenter himself and recognized exceptional work when he saw it. He admitted the construction quality was superior to anything he had built. The thermal logic made sense, but he shook his head when Matthias asked if he would consider similar construction for his own place. The social cost was too high, Henrik explained. He had a wife and children who needed to interact with the community. Being marked as the family that lived in a cave would isolate them from trade networks, social gatherings, and mutual aid arrangements that frontier families depended on. Even if the shelter worked perfectly, even if it saved fuel and provided better protection, the damage to their social standing would outweigh practical benefits. Henrik apologized. He wished Matthias well, but could not publicly support what he was doing. Matthias understood. He held no resentment toward Henrik or anyone else who refused to adopt his methods. Social structures mattered in frontier communities. Reputation determined whether neighbors would help during emergencies, whether traders would extend credit, whether your children would be welcome in other homes. Building into a cave violated unspoken rules about what civilized people did. Those who violated such rules paid prices that extended beyond simple mockery. He completed the interior work in December. A sleeping platform raised 2 feet off the stone floor, providing storage beneath and keeping the sleeping surface away from cold air that would settle at ground level. A table constructed with the same careful joinery used throughout the cabin. Shelves mounted high on the cave walls, using iron brackets anchored directly into the limestone. Every element was overbuilt by normal standards, but appropriate for Matthias's requirements. The window was small, 10 inches by 12 inches, positioned high on the wall 6 feet above the interior floor. The opening was cut through a single log, not at a joint between logs, eliminating a potential failure point. He created a shutter from thick planks reinforced with iron brackets, hinged on the interior. Behind the shutter, he installed his heavy canvas, stretched tight and covered with multiple layers of his clay resin mixture. The result was translucent, allowing diffused light to enter while maintaining insulation. It was far stronger than the oiled paper or rawhide most cabins used. By mid-December, the cave cabin was complete. 3 months of work. Matthias moved his supplies in, organized his provisions, and prepared for winter. The structure had cost him significant money, considerable time, and all his social standing in the settlement. The roof design was Matthias's most radical departure from conventional construction. Traditional cabins required extensive roof framing, rafters, ridge poles, and covering materials that would shed water and support snow loads. Matthias needed almost none of this. The cave's natural rock ceiling provided weatherproof coverage for most of the structure. He only needed to seal the gap between the top of his log wall and the rock overhang above. He built a simple shed roof that extended from the top log outward 8 feet to meet the rock overhang. The angle was shallow, about 15 degrees, just enough to shed water. He used split planks laid across support beams, creating a solid decking. Over this, he laid birch bark in overlapping layers, then applied his clay mixture, and finally covered everything with sod. The living grass and soil would root and create a living roof that was waterproof, fireproof from external sparks, and insulated against temperature extremes. The critical element was how this small roof transitioned into the natural rock ceiling. Matthias shaped the junction carefully, ensuring water would drain outward, never inward. He packed the connection points with extra clay resin mixture, creating a flexible seal that would accommodate minor settling without cracking. The result was seamless. Where his roof ended, the cave's ceiling began, and no observer could identify any weakness in the transition. Testing the roof's snow capacity was impossible until winter provided actual snow. But Matthias understood the physics. His small constructed roof section, built with substantial support beams spaced closely, could support several feet of snow without stress. The rock overhang could support infinite snow. There was no weight limit to solid stone that had existed for millennia. Traditional cabin roofs failed when snow loads exceeded the strength of rafters and ridge poles. Those failures typically occurred at 3 to 4 feet of accumulation. Matthias's roof had no such limit on the majority of its surface. The overhang provided another advantage. It extended 12 feet beyond the front wall, creating a covered area that would remain relatively dry even during heavy snow. This space would allow him to store firewood under cover, step outside without immediately being buried in snow, and maintain access to his door even when drifts piled high. Traditional cabins often became completely buried, with inhabitants forced to dig tunnels through snow to reach the door. Interior ventilation was carefully planned. The chimney provided primary air circulation, drawing fresh air from the lower door area, and exhausting it upward. But Matthias added secondary ventilation through small gaps he deliberately left at the top of his log wall where it met the roof. These gaps were too small to allow significant heat loss, but large enough to prevent moisture accumulation. In a sealed space, humidity from breathing, cooking, and the fire itself would condense on cold surfaces, creating ice buildup on interior walls. The small ventilation gaps would allow this moisture to escape gradually, maintaining dry conditions inside. The cave's natural breathing also contributed to air quality. Limestone is slightly porous, not enough to allow water penetration, but enough to allow very slow air exchange with the outside. This meant the cave would never become completely stagnant. Fresh air would infiltrate slowly through the rock itself, providing oxygen without creating drafts. Snow fell on December 18, 1870. Light, at first, then increasing through the day until it was coming down steadily. Matthias watched from his window as accumulation began. The temperature dropped to 10 degrees above zero by evening. He built a fire in his new fireplace using seasoned pine that caught quickly and burned hot. The flames reflected off the limestone walls, creating dancing light patterns throughout the cave. Smoke drew perfectly up the chimney without a trace of backflow. He monitored the interior temperature with his thermometer. When the fire was burning actively, the temperature near the fireplace reached 68 degrees. 10 feet away, near the sleeping platform, it was 56 degrees. At the back of the cave, 30 feet from the fire, it was 52 degrees. The heat was distributing through the space, warming the rock surfaces gradually. He could feel the difference in the walls. Where they had been cool to the touch earlier, they now felt neutral, approaching body temperature near the fireplace. After 4 hours, he let the fire burn down to coals, then to nothing. He wanted to test the heat retention without active flame. The results exceeded even his expectations. 1 hour after the fire died completely, the interior temperature had dropped only 3 degrees. 2 hours later, it had dropped another 2 degrees. The rate of cooling was remarkably slow. The heated rock was releasing its stored thermal energy gradually, replacing the heat that escaped through the front wall and small ventilation gaps. 6 hours after the fire died, the interior temperature stabilized at 47 degrees. Outside, the temperature had dropped to 5 degrees below zero. His cave cabin maintained an interior temperature 52 degrees warmer than the exterior without any active heat source. The rock mass was functioning exactly as he had calculated. It was storing thermal energy during the heating phase and releasing it slowly during the cooling phase, buffering the interior. Against external temperature swings, he slept comfortably that night under a single wool blanket. Casper lay on the floor near the sleeping platform, completely relaxed. In his previous cabin, multiple blankets and furs had been necessary, and even then he would wake to frost on the interior walls. Here, the walls remained dry. The air was cool, but not cold. His breath did not create visible vapor clouds. Morning brought more snow. 8 inches had accumulated overnight, covering his small roof section and the rock overhang above. Matthias built another fire, smaller this time, just enough to raise the interior temperature to a comfortable 60 degrees for working. The rock walls, still holding residual heat from the previous evening's fire, warmed quickly. Within an hour of lighting the morning fire, the cave cabin was genuinely comfortable. He calculated fuel consumption. The previous cabin had required continuous burning, consuming 12 to 15 logs per day during cold weather. Here, he had burned perhaps 8 logs total over 24 hours, and that included the initial heating phase when the rock mass was starting from a cool baseline. Once the rock was warm, maintaining temperature would require even less fuel. January brought sustained cold. Temperatures dropped below zero and stayed there for days at a time. Matthias maintained careful records, documenting exterior temperatures, interior temperatures, fuel consumption, and fire duration. The data told a clear story. His cave cabin was not marginally better than traditional construction. It was categorically superior in ways that would mean the difference between survival and death during extreme weather. On January 8th, the exterior temperature reached 28 degrees below zero. Matthias kept a fire burning through the afternoon and evening, letting it die around midnight. By morning, when the exterior temperature was 32 degrees below zero, the coldest point of the night, the interior had dropped to 44 degrees. He was sleeping comfortably. No frost formed on any interior surface. The rock walls felt cool, but not cold, to the touch. He visited Owen Blackwood's cabin 3 miles away during a brief warming period in mid-January. Owen was burning through his wood supply at an alarming rate, consuming 20 logs per day just to keep his interior above freezing. Despite the constant fire, frost covered the interior walls every morning. Owen's wife and children stayed wrapped in blankets near the fireplace all day. Moving 10 feet away from the flames meant entering air cold enough to see your breath. Owen asked how Matthias was managing. The question was awkward. Owen had been among the loudest mockers of the cave cabin plan. But cold winter nights reduced pride. Matthias described his fuel consumption honestly, about 8 logs per day, maintaining comfortable temperatures throughout the space. Owen looked skeptical, then angry. He accused Matthias of lying, of making up numbers to strange construction. Matthias shrugged and left. Thomas Kerr stopped by the trading post in late January looking exhausted. Benjamin Wade asked how his family was managing the cold. Thomas admitted they were struggling. His cabin could not hold heat adequately. They were burning furniture and fence rails to supplement their firewood supply, which was running dangerously low. His children were cold constantly despite staying within feet of the fireplace. His wife was developing a cough that sounded increasingly serious. Wade mentioned, almost casually, that he had heard Matthias Reichert was staying warm in his cave with minimal fuel use. Thomas's face darkened. He said he would rather freeze than live like an animal in a hole. Wade said nothing more, but he remembered the conversation. He was a businessman, and businessmen paid attention to which strategies succeeded and which failed. Matthias's approach was succeeding in measurable, undeniable ways. By February, Matthias's fuel supply remained adequate, while several families in the settlement were running dangerously low. He had cut and stacked 30 cords of wood before winter, expecting to need most of it. At current consumption rates, he would use perhaps 12 cords total. He had a surplus that would roll over to the following year, reducing next season's labor requirements. The settlement's reaction to Matthias's successful winter intensified through February and March. Instead of reconsidering their mockery, many doubled down on their criticism. The fact that his cave cabin worked better than traditional construction somehow made it more offensive, not less. Cyrus Dalton told anyone who would listen that Matthias's comfort proved he had abandoned proper Christian values. Real men suffered through hardship. Taking the easy path by hiding in a cave showed weakness of character. Reverend Ashford preached a sermon in early March about the importance of building properly, of doing things the right way, even when shortcuts were available. He never mentioned Matthias by name, but everyone understood the reference. The Reverend spoke about how civilization was defined by the structures people built, the customs they maintained, the standards they refused to compromise. Living in caves was regression, a return to pre-civilized existence that threatened the entire community's moral standing. Benjamin Wade's jokes at the trading post grew meaner. He started calling Matthias the Cave Bear and encouraged others to adopt the nickname. When Matthias came in for supplies, Wade would ask loudly if he needed anything special for his den. Other customers laughed. Some looked uncomfortable but said nothing. Speaking up would mean aligning themselves with someone the community had marked as deviant. The social isolation became complete. Families who had previously been cordial now avoided Matthias. Women would not speak to him. Men would not make eye contact. Children were warned to stay away from the strange man who lived like an animal. When Matthias attended church services in March, people moved away from where he sat. After the service, no one spoke to him during the social time when families normally gathered to exchange news and discuss community matters. Thomas Kerr was particularly hostile. His family had barely survived the winter. His wife's cough had worsened into a serious respiratory infection that took weeks to resolve. His children had been cold and miserable for months. His wood supply had run out in late February, forcing him to burn parts of his own cabin to maintain fire. The fact that Matthias had been warm and comfortable while the Kerr family suffered felt like a personal insult to Thomas. He began saying openly that Matthias should leave the settlement, that his presence was corrupting, that decent families should not have to associate with someone who rejected civilized standards. Henrik Larsson remained privately sympathetic, but would not defend Matthias publicly. Henrik's own family depended on community goodwill. Trade relationships, mutual aid agreements, social connections for his children, all these things required maintaining acceptable standing. Being known as the man who defended the cave dweller would damage those relationships. Henrik apologized to Matthias privately, explaining the impossible position. Matthias understood. He held no resentment. The social calculus was clear. Henrik was making the right choice for his family's welfare. By April, Matthias was effectively shunned. He could purchase supplies at the trading post because Wade's business interest overrode social considerations. But beyond commercial transactions, he had no place in settlement life. He attended church but sat alone. He saw neighbors but received no greetings. His successful innovation had cost him everything except survival itself. Winter 1870 to 1871 had been cold but manageable. Spring came late, as it often did in Montana Territory, but by May the worst seemed past. Families began preparing for summer work, repairing winter damage to cabins and fences, planting garden plots. The settlement relaxed into the rhythm of seasonal transition. Then January 1871 arrived with weather that old-timers would talk about for the rest of their lives. The first indication came on January 14th. The sky developed a peculiar yellowish cast. The air felt unnaturally still. Birds disappeared. Animals that normally moved through the forest seeking food were nowhere to be seen. Men who had lived through multiple frontier winters recognized these signs. Something bad was coming. They checked their wood supplies, reinforced their cabin doors, and brought livestock into whatever shelter they had available. The storm hit on January 15th. Snow began falling at dawn, light flurries that seemed unremarkable. By noon, the flurries had intensified into steady snowfall. By evening, it was coming down so heavily that visibility dropped to a few yards. The wind picked up, screaming through the pines, with a sound like continuous thunder. Temperature plummeted. Benjamin Wade's thermometer at the trading post read 15 degrees below zero at sunset. By midnight, it had dropped to 30 below. The snow continued through the 16th without pause. Accumulation was measured in feet, not inches. Drifts piled against cabin walls, climbing toward roof lines. The wind created bizarre formations, carving hollows in some areas while building massive drifts in others. Temperature continued dropping. Matthias's thermometer read 38 degrees below zero on the morning of the 17th. The wind chill made it effectively unsurvivable for exposed skin. Inside his cave cabin, Matthias maintained a steady fire and monitored conditions. His interior temperature held at 48 degrees with moderate fuel consumption. The key: rock walls continued their thermal buffering, absorbing heat during fire periods and radiating it back during cooling periods. He was comfortable, secure, and increasingly certain that others were not. Traditional cabins would be struggling catastrophically in these conditions. On the 17th, the temperature dropped to 45 degrees below zero. The storm showed no signs of weakening. Snow had accumulated to 4 feet in level areas, with drifts reaching 8 to 10 feet. Matthias stood under his rock overhang, protected from the worst of the wind, and looked out at conditions that would kill anyone caught outside for more than a few minutes. His door was secure, his walls were holding, his fuel supply was adequate. But he knew that across the settlement, families were fighting for survival in structures never designed for this level of assault. He brought extra firewood under the overhang, stacking it where it would stay dry and accessible. He filled containers with water, melted from snow, ensuring adequate supply if the storm prevented him from going outside. He organized his interior space to accommodate additional people if necessary. The thought felt presumptuous, given how completely the settlement had shunned him, but logic overrode pride. If people were dying, they would seek any shelter available. The Dalton cabin roof failed on the morning of January 18th. Cyrus Dalton heard the rafters cracking under snow load and managed to get his family out seconds before the entire structure came down. They stood in the storm, surrounded by the wreckage of their home, with no shelter and a temperature at 42 degrees below zero. Cyrus's wife was screaming. His 3 children were already shaking with cold. He made the only choice available and led his family toward Owen Blackwood's cabin a mile away. They barely made it. The wind and snow disoriented them. Cyrus's youngest child, a boy of 6, collapsed halfway there. Cyrus carried him the rest of the distance. Owen took them in, but his cabin was already at capacity with his own family of 5. 9 people crowded into a space designed for seasonal occupation by fewer. The fire roared constantly, consuming wood at an unsustainable rate. The interior temperature struggled to reach 35 degrees despite the flames. Thomas Kerr's cabin roof held longer, but failed on the evening of the 18th. The ridgepole cracked with a sound like a gunshot. Thomas had seconds to grab his children and push them toward the door before the center section collapsed inward. Snow poured through the opening, smothering the fire instantly. The temperature inside the damaged cabin dropped toward exterior levels within minutes. Thomas's wife Margaret gathered what blankets she could carry. Thomas took both children. They fled into the storm. Thomas had no plan beyond survival. His nearest neighbor was 3 miles away through conditions that made navigation nearly impossible. He chose A direction and started walking, carrying his youngest child while Margaret held their daughter's hand and tried to shield her from the wind. They were going to die. Thomas knew it within the first 100 yards. The cold was physically painful, penetrating through their heavy clothing in seconds. His face went numb. His hands, even inside thick mittens, lost feeling. The children were crying, but the wind tore the sound away. Then he saw light. Faint, golden, impossibly warm-looking through the white chaos. He turned toward it, stumbling, no longer certain if it was real or a hallucination brought on by freezing. But the light grew stronger. He could see the outline of a structure, smoke rising from a chimney, a covered area beneath a rock overhang. The cave cabin, Matthias Reichert's impossible shelter, the place Thomas had mocked more viciously than anyone else in the settlement. Thomas nearly collapsed at the door. His wife was barely conscious, hypothermia setting in rapidly. Both children were limp and unresponsive. Thomas pounded on the heavy log door with numb fists, knowing even as he did that this man he had called an animal, whose construction he had called an insult to civilization, was their only chance at survival. The door opened. Warm air poured out, shocking after the deadly cold. Matthias stood there, backlit by firelight, looking at the family that had wanted him driven from the settlement. He said nothing. He simply stepped aside and pulled them inside. Matthias closed the door against the storm and turned to assess the situation. Thomas Kerr's youngest child, the boy, was unconscious and blue-lipped. The daughter was semi-conscious, shaking violently. Margaret was on the edge of consciousness. Thomas was in better condition, but showing signs of frostbite on his face and hands. Matthias moved quickly, drawing on knowledge learned during his trapping years when cold injuries were common. He pulled the children close to the fire, but not too close. Rapid rewarming could be as dangerous as the cold itself. He wrapped them in blankets, multiple layers, creating insulation that would allow their bodies to rewarm gradually from their own retained heat. He gave Margaret warm water, just sips at first, nothing hot that would shock her system. Thomas he positioned near the fire, examining his hands for damage. The fingers were white and hard, definitely frostbitten, but probably not severely enough to require amputation if treated properly. The cave cabin's temperature had dropped slightly when the door opened, falling from 48 degrees to 42. But the thermal mass recovered quickly. Within 20 minutes of closing the door, the interior was back to 46 degrees and rising. The fire burned steadily. The rock walls radiated their stored heat. The space that had been comfortable for one man now held 5 people, but it remained adequate. The thermal buffer was sufficient. Thomas Kerr's son regained consciousness after 30 minutes. He started crying, a good sign that indicated returning awareness and circulation. The daughter came around more slowly, confused and frightened. Margaret recovered enough to hold her children, weeping with relief. Thomas sat in silence, staring at the fire, struggling to process what had happened. His cabin was destroyed. His family had nearly died, and they had been saved by the man he had most viciously attacked. The storm continued through the 19th. Matthias shared his food supplies, rationing carefully because he had not planned for 5 people. The cave cabin proved its capacity. 5 bodies generated more heat than 1, reducing the fire requirements. The rock continued its thermal regulation. The interior temperature stabilized at 50 degrees, genuinely comfortable despite the hell raging outside. On the afternoon of the 19th, there was pounding at the door. Matthias opened it to find Silas Crawford, an older trapper who lived alone 4 miles west. Silas had attempted to ride out the storm in his cabin until the cold became unsurvivable. His fire could not keep pace with heat loss. The interior had dropped below 20 degrees despite continuous burning. He had made the desperate choice to leave and seek help, somehow finding his way through the whiteout to the only light visible across miles of frozen landscape. Matthias pulled Silas inside. 6 people now. The cave cabin held them all. That evening, Henrik Larsson arrived with his wife and 2 children. Henrik's cabin was intact, but the cold was killing them. Interior temperature had dropped to 15 degrees. His children were becoming hypothermic. Henrik had remembered Matthias's explanations about thermal mass, about heat retention, about the cave's advantages. He had swallowed his pride and led his family through the storm to the shelter he had refused to publicly support. The storm finally broke on January 21st. 3 days of continuous snow and wind ended, as abruptly as they had begun. The sky cleared to brilliant blue. Temperature remained brutally cold, 30 degrees below zero, but the wind died and the snow stopped falling. Matthias opened his door to a transformed landscape. Drifts reached 12 feet in places. The settlement's scattered cabins were buried or collapsed. His cave cabin stood unchanged, the rock overhang shedding snow, as it had for thousands of years before humans arrived. 12 people had sheltered in the cave over the storm's duration. The Kerr family, Silas Crawford, the Larsson family, and 3 others who had arrived on the 20th when their own shelters failed. Matthias had stretched his supplies thin, but everyone survived. The cave's thermal mass had supported them all. Interior temperature never dropped below 45 degrees despite housing 12 bodies and keeping the fire relatively small to conserve dwindling fuel. The settlement began counting casualties on January 22nd, when travel became marginally possible. Owen Blackwood's cabin had survived structurally, but consumed every piece of burnable material inside. His family survived but lost everything they owned to the fire that kept them alive. The Daltons, sheltered with the Blackwoods, survived as well, but returned to find their collapsed cabin buried under 8 feet of snow. Others were not as fortunate. The Morrison family, living 5 miles south, died together in their cabin when the roof collapsed and trapped them beneath snow and broken rafters. They froze before they could dig free. An elderly trapper named Joseph Wells was found dead in his cabin. His fire burned out, his body frozen solid in his chair. A family named Patterson, relative newcomers to the territory, died attempting to reach the trading post when their cabin became uninhabitable. Their bodies were found a quarter mile from their destination, huddled together beneath a pine tree. Benjamin Wade tallied 7 confirmed deaths from the storm, with 2 more people missing and presumed dead. 20 families had suffered cabin damage, ranging from minor to total destruction. Every household had depleted winter supplies catastrophically. The settlement faced a crisis of survival extending beyond the immediate storm. Spring was still months away. Damaged cabins would be difficult to repair in continued cold. Food and fuel supplies were critically low across the entire community. The survivors who had sheltered in Matthias's cave cabin returned to ruined homes, but with a changed perspective. Thomas Kerr stood in the wreckage of his collapsed cabin and understood that his children were alive only because the man he had called an animal possessed knowledge he had rejected. Henrik Larsson examined his intact but thermally inadequate cabin and recognized that survival depended on principles he had understood intellectually but failed to implement. By late February, 4 families were actively searching for suitable caves. Owen Blackwood approached Matthias directly, asking for detailed explanations of the construction techniques. The mockery had ended, replaced by desperate interest in methods that had proven their value through the harshest test imaginable. Cyrus Dalton never apologized, but he stopped making jokes. His silence was acknowledgment enough. Spring 1871 brought assessment and rebuilding. The settlement had been devastated by the blizzard, but survival created knowledge. Families who rebuilt their cabins incorporated elements of Matthias's design even when they could not find suitable caves. Superior chinking techniques, reinforced doors, better chimney construction, all these innovations spread through practical necessity. The principle that survival mattered more than social convention became impossible to ignore after 7 people died in structures built the traditional way, while 12 survived in a cave dwelling. Thomas Kerr found a shallow overhang 5 miles west and built a hybrid shelter that used the rock face as one wall. His new structure was not as sophisticated as Matthias's cave cabin, but it incorporated the fundamental concepts: reduced surface area for heat loss, integration with natural thermal mass, superior sealing and insulation. His family would never be warm as they had been in Matthias's shelter during the storm, but they would never again face the deadly cold that had nearly killed them. Henrik Larsson rebuilt his cabin with doubled wall thickness, careful log fitting, and extensive use of Matthias's clay horsehair resin chinking mixture. He could not replicate the thermal mass advantage without a cave, but he could eliminate the drafts and gaps that had made his previous structure inadequate. His fuel consumption dropped by 40% compared to the previous winter. His family stayed warmer with less effort. By summer, the phrase "built solid" as Reichert's Place had entered local vocabulary. The specific reference to the cave cabin faded over time, but the underlying meaning persisted. Superior construction, thoughtful engineering, structures built to withstand the worst conditions imaginable. Matthias had become, almost against his will, the settlement's authority on winter shelter design. People sought his advice. He shared his techniques freely, as he always had. The knowledge belonged to anyone who needed it. The social rehabilitation was incomplete and awkward. Some families remained uncomfortable around him. The stigma of cave dwelling never entirely disappeared, but survival created a kind of respect that transcended social convention. The man who had been shunned was now consulted. The shelter that had been mocked was now studied. Matthias accepted this change without satisfaction or resentment. He had never built his cave cabin for recognition. He had built it because Elise died in inadequate shelter, and he refused to accept that outcome as inevitable. He lived in the cave cabin for another 6 years, trapping and hunting through the mountains, surviving winters that would have killed him in traditional construction. In 1877, he sold his claim and moved to Oregon Territory, seeking a quieter life away from the mountains that held difficult memories. He died in 1893 at age 59, buried in a small cemetery outside Salem. His gravestone mentioned nothing about caves or cabins or survival innovations, but in Montana, the cave cabin stood for decades after he left. Other trappers occupied it seasonally. Settlers used it as a way station. Hunters sheltered there during storms. The structure required almost no maintenance. The rock endured. The log wall, built with obsessive care, remained sound for 40 years before finally deteriorating. By then, the principles Matthias had demonstrated had spread throughout the region. The impossible innovation had become accepted knowledge, and the man who proved that engineering could triumph over all. Convention had earned a legacy carved not in monuments, but in the survival of those who learned from what he built.